Alf. Yves Colombe's cigarette lay in the ashtray, its blue smoke curling up towards the ceiling. For an hour he'd been staring at the same piece of white paper that lay like a sacrificial virgin in the typewriter, just waiting for inspiration from the high priest. But no words apart from those of his wife found their way into his muddled brain. He absent-mindedly fondled Alf, who lay curled up in the out tray to the left of the typewriter. The smoky grey cat broke into a low and comforting purr. Yves's wife had left him. Her lover, Gérard, had walked into the apartment with her one evening and had started droning on about how they were all adult, civilized people and could talk about it. The man's passiveness was sickening. In any case, there was nothing to talk about, and he wasn't going to plead with a woman who had obviously made a decision a long time ago, and certainly not in front of this popinjay. In retrospect, he could understand Clara, confronted with a choice between him and his corduroy jacket with the leather pads on the elbows, and this clothes horse from the bank. The man reeked of aftershave and superiority, and he had the patronising voice of a seemingly patient teacher with a very short fuse. Clara had never understood Yves's need to write, and he had never appreciated her desire for expensive clothes and jewellery. He disliked the shallowness of her Parisian society friends, and she, in a nutshell, hated cats. End of story. The room still rang with the sound of her strident voice, and her last words of just 2 days ago hung in the air like Gerard's aftershave, sickly sweet and overpowering. She had said something scathing about his work, of course, and then, as an afterthought, in case that hadn't hurt enough, had added her advice about having Alf put down because he shed hairs everywhere. Of course, it was jealousy, urged on by the fact that the night she had packed, Alf had managed to get into her suitcase and had played havoc with her Angora sweaters. Yves allowed himself a little smile at the picture it conjured up, and stroked Alf again. If ever he lived with another woman, which he doubted he would, she would have to like cats. No, she would have to love cats. It sounded excessive, but he owed Alf that. If it hadn't been for Alf, he'd have lost his mind long ago. He stubbed out the cigarette and mechanically lit another one, and pushing himself back from his desk, viewed the dreaded piece of paper as if looking at it from a distance would make his deadline seem further away. The movement disturbed the cat, who stood up and stretched luxuriously. He jumped down and trotted to the front door and looked back at Yves with that familiar expression. Yves hated him going out into the street, but knew the cat had to have its liberty. It was a part of the deal. Yves had found him in the little side street 4 years ago, weak and cold with a broken leg. He had taken him in, much to Clara's disgust, paid the vet's bills and nursed him back to health. But as the cat was adult already and more or less streetwise, he had given him his freedom when he scratched on the door and asked to go out. Yves's joy had been immense when, that evening, there came a gentle scratching at the door, and Alf had walked back in as if he'd been doing the same thing for years. It was clear. He was here to stay. Alf rubbed his head on Yves's legs and let out a little sound that only the two of them understood, and Yves stroked the grey back, venting all his sadness and tenderness on his friend. Yes, thank God for Alf. He opened the door and the cat ran down the flight of stairs that led to the street. Once outside, Alf ran along the side of the buildings, belly almost to the ground, and down the little side street. It was a dangerous road at the end, so near the roundabout, but it wasn't far from the little park. Alf squeezed through the hole in the metal fence, which was hidden by the litter bin. Fur had been left on the jagged edges where larger animals had tried to get through, and there was a distinct smell of dog's urine on the bin itself, and although dogs weren't theoretically allowed in the little park, once Alf was inside he crouched behind the hedge, observing the lay of the land before venturing out into the open. The old lady with the walking stick was sitting there on her bench. Breadcrumbs clung to the sleeves of her tweed coat, with the pigeons beside her furiously pecking them off. She eyed Alf suspiciously as he wandered by. On another bench sat the old boy, feet wrapped in sacking and wearing a heavy overcoat which seemed several sizes too big for him. A bottle of cheap red wine stood on the gravel beside him as he hungrily eyed the bread being thrown to the birds. A small, thin woman stood on the grass surrounded by a field of cats that formed a small crop of perpendicular tails around her legs. She was feeding them scraps from a plastic supermarket bag, and Alf watched, fascinated by the concentration of so many strays. The sun made a rare appearance, and he rolled on his back, content in the knowledge that he was safe in this haven of peace in the middle of busy Paris. Even the noise of the cars seemed muffled. Suddenly, with the total surprise of a fighter jet shrieking over a sleepy village, a fox terrier came charging through the open gate. The cats scattered like autumn leaves in a whirlwind and clawed their way up the nearest tree trunks and darted behind the bushes. But Alf, in his vulnerable position, had no time to beat a retreat, and the fox terrier stopped in his tracks and started barking impetuously at him. Alf arched his back and bristled his fur as an irate woman came charging into the park, brandishing a lead with a collar dangling on the end of it. "Bobby! Bobby! Viens ici!" she screamed. Feeling that reinforcements had arrived, Bobby took a lunge at the cat and grabbed one of its hind legs in his needle-sharp teeth. The searing pain made Alf strike back at the dog with such blind ferocity that the dog let go, and Alf managed to struggle free and rush out of the gate and into the street. Alf didn't even look back to see if the owner had caught the dog, but kept running as fast as his wounded leg would allow. He threw himself over a wall and down an alley, weaving in and out of dustbins and parked cars, amongst waves of smells he didn't recognise, and finally came to a halt in front of an open doorway that led to a courtyard, and he slunk behind the door. His heart was pounding in his small chest, and he could smell his own blood as he waited there for any menacing sound, but all he heard was that of a whistling kettle, the same noise as at home. When his heart had slowed to a gentler pace, he came limping from behind the door. This was not his territory, but the sound of the kettle was familiar, and it encouraged him to investigate. The whistle slid down the scale to silence, and he looked up at the sill on the ground floor window from where the sound had come. The sill was covered in pots containing wilted, uncared-for plants, but the window was ajar, and in spite of the pain he managed to leap up without knocking the pots over, and stuck his nose through the opening. It didn't smell of dog, so he pushed the window open a little wider with his paw. His eyes adapted quickly to the darkened interior. In the middle of the room was a table strewn with papers, in the centre of which stood a vase of drooping flowers. Behind this was the hunched form of a woman. Steam rising from a mug stood beside an elbow. The elbow moved. Rose's eyes hurt her. The tears had taken their toll. He had gone, and no amount of self-pity would bring him back. But if only she could stop crying. She had read his old love letters over and over again in an effort to persuade herself that it hadn't all been a figment of her imagination. How could they have been written by the same man who had so violently walked out of her life just 2 days ago, spouting such cruel words? She wondered who this woman was, the one that he had described as knowing how to dress and behave suitably at the sort of social gatherings that I'm required to attend. Rose's veterinary practice involved handling animals, and sometimes getting bitten or scratched, and she knew that her nails were a far cry from the elegantly manicured ones that a woman of refined society would dare to be seen dead with. But Gerard had known all this when they got together. His job at the bank wouldn't have been her choice of career, but Gerard seemed to enjoy his work, and she had to admit, he looked quite dashing in his beautifully cut suits. She burst into tears again, and with an uncharacteristic vehemence sent the papers flying with a sweep of her arm. Her hand caught the flower vase, and that followed the papers, crashing to the floor. And then she saw the little face at the window. At first it was just a blur against the comparatively bright light from outside, but then, as her vision cleared, the blur emitted a little cry and jumped onto a chair under the window. Rose saw the blood on the cat's thigh and was instantly on her feet. She spoke to him in soft, comforting whispers, and she stroked his head, and her expert hand slid down his back and stopped when it reached the leg. She felt it gently, and the cat let out only a small sound, no menacing growl or bite. This was a nice cat, a loved cat, a cat who belonged to someone who cared. She shut the window and filled a bowl with water, which she put on the table, and then gently lifted the cat onto it. While he drank thirstily, she got her veterinary kit out of the cupboard where it had remained too long. When she had finished dressing the wound, she placed the cat on a rug on the settee and sat stroking its big head as it purred its way to sleep. It was good to have an animal in the house again. Gerard hated cats, and although he had mentioned having a guard dog for security reasons, he had never ceased to emphasize the disadvantages, such as taking it for walks and letting it into the house. "You did choose the right time to come to the right address, didn't you?" she said wistfully, suddenly surprised at the sound of her own voice, a sound she hadn't heard for 2 days apart from the sobbing. And then she started crying again. But the tears were different. They were tears of resignation and no longer had the acid taste of resentment. This little cat had brought a shadow of hope into her life. The cat was too weak to move for 3 days, and Rose spent her time taking its temperature and giving it the antibiotic injections which were needed to ensure that such a cruel wound wouldn't fester. She was happy to have an occupation, something worthwhile to take her mind off her own miseries, but she was worried about the unknown, anxious owner of her new, nameless friend. Someone, somewhere, was going without sleep. Eve had combed the area, especially at night, walking along the empty, cold, dark streets, shaking the box of Alf's favourite biscuits, and attracting almost every dog and cat in the area but the one his heart so longed to see. He left the door open at night and slept fitfully, hoping that Alf would be there in the morning. By the 4th day he was beside himself with grief, a pain far worse than that of the loss of his wife. He wrote little notes with his telephone number on, offering an exorbitant reward, and stuck them in the local shop windows. He would give everything he had to the person who could find Alf. It was the baker who suggested he put the ad in the local paper. Alf was slowly getting stronger. He'd had a bad time, but Rose knew the day would come when he would want to leave, and she was dreading it. She bought him steak to nurse him back to health and strength, and one day even got him some fresh filleted fish in an effort to persuade him to stay. She unwrapped it and was about to throw the newspaper away when an ad caught her eye. It was a cry from the heart, and the despair in the wording brought tears to her eyes again. From the description, it couldn't be any other cat than this Alf. Alf, what a perfect name. It suited him. As she watched him eat the fish, she smiled a sad little smile at the animal that had become her saviour. She wondered who his master or mistress was, and knew that she would soon find out. She hoped they would be gentle and kind. She thought about life without him, hesitated a moment and then sighed. It was wrong to make another person suffer in order to be happy oneself, and with a heavy heart her hand went reluctantly to the telephone. Little did she know that from every point of view it was to be the best decision she had ever made in her life.